Hi guys, and welcome to Drive to School Chat, where we discuss a subtopic in geography on the way to school. Now today I'd like us to talk about the factors that have influenced the landscape of the UK. So this is under UK's evolving physical landscapes, which is topic 4 in our specification, which is EdXLB. Now, when we are talking about the landscape of the UK, it's important to think about the factors that have influenced it over time. Because when we are talking about UK's evolving landscapes, we are talking about how the UK physical landscape has evolved over time. And obviously, this is over a long period of time. Now, in 2019, in paper 2, section A, which is about topic 5, the 8-mark question said, assess the influence of geology on the landscape of the UK. So geology, obviously, then is one of the factors that has influenced the landscape of the UK. But then, obviously, when we are answering an 8-mark question, we do that as a kind of a debate. So we do not just discuss one factor. In this case, for example, we would discuss several factors and then come to a decisive conclusion or judgment about which of those factors we have discussed is the most important in terms of influencing the landscape of the UK. Now, that question had a map, or it had two maps rather. So those two maps, one of the maps was showing the geology of the UK, and the other map was showing the relief or the landscape of the UK. And of course, you've been asked to assess how geology has influenced the landscape of the UK. So we are going to discuss those factors that influence the landscape of the UK within those parameters this morning. All right. So let's start with that question first of all, and with those two maps that were in that question. Now, one of the maps obviously was showing the geology of the UK, and when we are talking about geology, we are talking about the study of rocks. That is what geology is, and therefore, that map was showing where we find different types of rock in the UK. And we know that there are three types of rock. We have igneous rocks, we have metamorphic rocks, and then we also have sedimentary rocks. And we also know that out of those three, the least resistant rock is sedimentary rock. And obviously, that sedimentary rock, if it's found in an area, it's likely to erode a lot faster than the igneous and metamorphic rock. So that's the first thing we need to just say before we carry on. And then the second thing we need to say is that we then find different types of rock in different parts of the UK. And that's why on the next map that shows the landscape or the relief of the UK, we have different colors because it was a choropleth map which uses color to show that relief of the UK. And the brown areas obviously representing where you have upland landscape, and then the green areas representing where you have lowland landscape. Now, the next thing then is the Tees-exe line. Now, the Tees-exe line is an imaginary line that goes all the way from the River Tees to the River Exe. And that divides the UK, or that line, imaginary line, divides the UK into upland landscapes and lowland landscapes. And then if we now compare the two maps that were in that exam, those maps would indicate that, or the general pattern showed that you have metamorphic and igneous rocks in those places that are to the north and the northwest of the Tees-exe line. And that is where we have the upland areas. So you can correlate those maps and say that there's a direct correlation between the landscape of the UK and the geology of the UK. And your explanation for that would be that in the areas that are to the north and the northwest of the UK, such as Scotland, for example, because you've got to cite examples in your 8-mark question, have upland landscape. And the reason for that is because the rocks there are metamorphic and igneous rocks, which are a lot more resistant and therefore will erode slower to leave upland landscapes or to leave mountainous areas. Then the next thing you want to talk about is where the lowland landscape is. And obviously that is to the south and to the southeast of the UK. So what do you say? You say that the map is also showing a direct correlation between the areas that have sedimentary rock and the lowland areas. So the sedimentary rock, or most of the sedimentary rock, is found to the south and the southeast of the UK. And that is where we also have the lowland landscape. And this is where the less resistant sedimentary rock has eroded a lot faster to create lowland landscapes. Okay, so that is geology. And the geology of the UK, or the rock types in the UK, have influenced that landscape of the UK. Right, now, because it's an 8-marker, like we had said at the beginning, we will then now talk about other factors so that at the end, when we are making our conclusion and our judgment, we can decide which of those factors has been, or yes, which of the factors has been the most important in influencing the landscape of the UK. So what's another factor? Now, if we were to talk about physical factors and historic factors for that matter, then we talk about tectonics or tectonic activity. So tectonic activity has also influenced the landscape of the UK. And that is because in our specification, we do talk about the fact that the UK was once under tropical oceans, and that folding and faulting, folding led to that landscape, or that landscape, yes, that was in under those tropical oceans to be pushed upwards. And when that landscape was pushed upwards, it ended up above the surface of the water, and that makes up some of the landscape of the UK. And then the other thing is that the UK was once closer to the plate boundaries. Now we know that because we have also studied the theory of continental drift, where we know that the continents were all once part of a big landmass called Pangaea, but that split up due to continental drift, and the continents drifted apart. So at some point, the UK was close to the tectonic plates, and as a result of that, there was tectonic activity in the UK, and that tectonic activity led to the formation of certain landscapes here in the country. So one of those landscapes that we can talk about are fault scarps. So fault scarps. Now, in the areas as that folding was taking place, fault scarps were created. And in the UK, we have examples of fault scarps being created. So like in Yorkshire. So Yorkshire has fault scarps, one of them being Gigglewick Scar, obviously in Yorkshire. And that's an example of faulting, or that tectonic activity of folding creating those fault scarps in the UK. So tectonics has had a role to play as well. Now, when we talk about landforms that are created by tectonic activity, we also have to consider batholiths. And batholiths are a landscape that is created, initially, it's an intrusive landscape or landform. Intrusive means that it has been formed by magma solidifying, magma solidifying below the ground. And when that magma solidifies below the ground, it obviously forms a rock, and that is a batholith. Now, those batholiths were then, or then ended up being seen here in the UK because as erosion and weathering happened above those batholiths, the soil, the sediment, and the rock that was a lot less resistant, that was sitting on top of that batholith, was eroded. And eventually, that batholith or those batholiths could now be seen on the UK landscape because of the erosion that has taken place, excuse me, above them. So again, tectonic activity has had an impact on the landscape of the UK by creating batholiths and those fault scarps. So that is tectonic activity. Now, what else has had an influence on the landscape of the UK? There's glaciation as well. And we know that there was a glacial period in the UK around, well, roughly 11,000 to 20,000 years ago. Now, that glacial period obviously was characterized by glaciation, which means ice sheets were moving across the country. So those ice sheets also changed the landscape of the UK. And in places where you had V-shaped valleys, and we know that V-shaped valleys are landforms that are created by rivers. But in places where we had V-shaped valleys, we ended up having rivers of ice flowing through those landscapes or through those V-shaped valleys. And we know that ice takes up 10% more space than water. So it takes up a lot more space than rivers. And as a result of that, and because, well, it's a huge ice sheet, first of all, and then it's flowing at a fast rate, and therefore is likely to cause a lot more erosion than river water would. So that means that that V-shaped valley is going to change its shape because of the amount of erosion that is now taking place due to this ice sheet that is flowing through the landscape. So what does that cause then? So it turns those V-shaped valleys into U-shaped valleys. Now, clearly, that is also another way that the landscape of the UK has been changed or transformed or influenced, and that is by glaciation. Okay, so after the glacial period, however, obviously that ice melted because we are now in a interglacial period. Sorry, actually, a glacial period is a cold one where you have an ice age, and then an interglacial is the warmer period. So when the warmer period now came, the one that we have today, we now no longer had ice sheets flowing over the landscape. Instead, what we had was rivers again. So that river water was now flowing so the rivers were now flowing in a very wide U-shaped valley. So instead of it being a V-shaped valley, because it has now been eroded by the ice sheets, it's now a lot wider, the valley is a lot wider, and it's U-shaped, and therefore the river is flowing at the bottom of a very wide valley. So that river will look out of place because ordinarily it would be flowing through a much narrower valley. So again, that type of river is called a misfit river because it does not fit in with the landscape that is around it. And obviously, again, we can see that glaciation, or we can say that glaciation has influenced the landscape of the UK because it turned those V-shaped valleys into U-shaped valleys and created misfit rivers in the landscape or on the landscape of the UK. Now, the other thing that we can talk about here actually is the fact that in those wide valleys, sometimes when there are periods of very heavy rainfall, you will have those misfit rivers bursting their banks. So they flood. And when they flood, they obviously flood onto that river valley bottom, which is really wide. And because of that, they end up depositing sediment or alluvium, it's called, onto that valley bottom or U-shaped valley bottom. When that happens, it makes the soil very fertile because we know that that sediment is made up of remains of rock, and rocks normally have nutrients within them. They have minerals rather within them, and those minerals make very good nutrients that make the soil fertile. So we will find that on those valley bottoms, you will have farming taking place around the river. Why? Because of that sediment that has been deposited and that has made that soil a lot more fertile. Okay, so glaciation has had a big influence on the landscape of the UK. So those are two physical factors other than just the, on top of the geology. So tectonic activity and glaciation. Okay, so what are the factors? Now, obviously, you do not have to discuss all these factors. You can discuss 3 and then come up with your conclusion. But it's good for us to discuss all of them so that you know them and can decide which one it is that you want to discuss. Okay, so now we'll move on to human influences on the landscape of the UK. And the first one that we are going to discuss is just human activity. So human activity has had an influence or an impact on the landscape of the UK. So for example, urbanization that has taken place. And we know that as urbanization takes place, you're going to have buildings. And for those buildings, you will also need infrastructure to support the people that live in that housing and work in those buildings. You will need shops, you will need schools, you'll need hospitals, you need all sorts of infrastructure. You'll need roads, you'll need railway lines, and so on. Now, for all that to be built, some deforestation is going to have to take place, and the landscape is going to change. The way the landscape looks is going to definitely change. And we know that it's not just urbanization, but you've got other things such as industry as well. So industrialization taking place. We have other things like power plants being built. So we need, the landscape is changing due to that. We have farming that is taking place as the population of the country continues to increase. And as farming takes place, a lot more land is going to be used up for that farming. And obviously, the landscape is going to change, or that landscape is going to change as a result of that. So human activity has also contributed to the way the landscape of the UK looks and has changed and transformed the landscape of the UK. Now, I've just talked about that briefly. As far as the human activity goes, I've talked about it very briefly. I'll be talking about it in a different video, which I'll probably link in the description below, so that if you want to look at that in a little more detail, you can do so. Okay, so what other human activity or human influence has there been that has also influenced, that has influenced the landscape of the UK? And that is climate change. That is human caused or human induced, if you like. And climate change means that the landscape of the UK is going to change because we are a country that is, we are an island, and therefore we are surrounded by coast. And so the UK coastline is changing. And it's changing rapidly as a result of climate change. Now, as we have increasing temperatures, or the temperatures continue to increase, then we have more storms at sea. And the sea is a lot more volatile. We have, because of increasing sea levels, or what we could also refer to as, well, not what we could refer to as, but something different, not just the sea level rising as a result of ice caps melting, but we also have the issue of thermal expansion, which is where the seas become a lot more, well, they expand a lot more and they have a lot more water due to that increase in temperature. Okay, so that then is causing a lot more storms at sea. And if we have a lot more storms, that means that the UK coastlines are going to be battered by those storms. And those storms are going to cause the erosion rates to increase. And as those erosion rates increase, then it means that the landscape of the UK is going to change, because we will have more eroded areas and a lot more coastline is going to be washed away into the sea. Okay, so let's do a very quick recap. What have we talked about today? We have had a discussion around the 8 marker and an 8 marker in the 2019 paper, and that 8 marker was to assess the influence of geology on the landscape of the UK. And we said that there are several influences. And those influences include geology, glaciation, tectonic activity, we talked about human activity, and we've also now discussed climate change. Now, before we actually finish, it would be good for you, if you are doing that 8-mark question, to then come up with a conclusion to say which one you think has been the most influential in determining what the landscape of the UK looks like, or in shaping the landscape of the UK. And obviously, there is no wrong or right answer. You can decide, it's geology. You could decide it's glaciation. You could decide it's human activity. But what you have to do is then to support your answer with enough evidence, and then that will give you those top-level marks. And then, you don't have to decide on one. You could actually say, and this is a valid and a conclusion to come to, you could actually decide, you know what, it's not just an isolated factor, but it's all these factors working in tandem or working together to influence the landscape of the UK. So that's actually a conclusion that you can come up to. Or you can come to. Right. So thank you very much for joining me in this drive to school chat and on this journey towards excellent exam results. If there is a topic that you'd like us to discuss on the way to school, please let me know in the comments section below, and we shall be sure to discuss it one of these fine mornings as we make our way to school. All the best, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.